Mr. Chairman, I just returned from traveling to visit with other governments in Europe who have been receiving Ukrainian refugees, who have been standing up to Russia. It was an important series of meetings, but every single meeting started with expressions of sympathy and condolences and questions about how it is that the United States continues to have this horrific gun violence problem. I thought it would be important just to respond to some of what we've heard and to make clear what we're actually doing here. First of all, to the ranking member and to Mr. Bishop, I so resent being told that I don't care about the Constitution. We all do, and you know it's not true. Yes, there's a Ninth Circuit decision. There are also other circuits who have come down the other way. And when you refer to Heller, I think it's important to point out the words of Justice Scalia in the Heller decision when he said, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited, who then went on to explain exactly how. So let's at least be clear that what's happening here, first of all, is constitutional. Now let's talk about what we're trying to do. We already passed legislation to require a check of one's background to make sure you don't have a violent history. There's nobody who's watching this who thinks that if you have a violent history, you should be able to buy a firearm. That's just straightforward. That's what we already passed, and that's what the Senate needs to bring up and pass. And look at what's in this bill. Raise the age for purchasing a semi-automatic rifle from 18 to 21. Let's also acknowledge that in America, you can't buy a handgun unless you're 21. That somehow hasn't been brought up today. By the way, you also can't buy a drink and you can't buy tobacco unless you're 21 either, but you can go in and you can buy a semi-automatic assault rifle, which, by the way, for every time someone sits in this meeting and says, well, nothing we're doing here would have prevented this. Well, actually, if we had a law that said you have to be 21 to buy, then these two AR-15s would not have been purchased. So that's what the 18 to 21 is. Also, Florida, my own Florida, raised the age to buy a gun to 21. It's a really important step that we can take. Also, we'll be voting, before we get back to this, we'll be voting on red flag laws, which Florida passed, which have now been used 5,800 times to make sure that people with violent histories don't do harm to themselves or to others. Florida did that. We want federal offenses for gun trafficking and straw purchases because we don't want people to feel that they're able to simply bring guns to cities that don't have restrictions, don't buy them where they don't have restrictions, take them to other cities. We're tough on crime in this committee, right? We all ought to be supportive of cracking down on gun traffickers who put people's lives at risk. Safe storage of firearms. Look, if you have a child in your house, my guess is for every one of my colleagues on this committee who owns a firearm, you store it safely. But shouldn't everyone, if they have a child in their house, have to store their firearm safely? That's what this bill does. Bump stocks. Let's remember what bump stocks are. Bump stocks in Las Vegas allowed the shooter to fire off his gun as to do it more rapidly, to do it almost as a fully automatic rifle. Well, President Trump wanted to get rid of those. We're getting rid of them here. Everybody ought to be supportive of that. And then finally, on high capacity magazines, all we're doing is limiting the capacity. And we're not banning guns. We're not taking anyone's guns away. We're not taking anyone's magazine away either. We're limiting it. And you know why? Because when a shooter goes into a school and has to reload, or goes anyplace else where there are mass shootings, which is everywhere, and has to reload, it provides an opportunity for someone to stop him and stop the killing. That's what that's about. And I'll finish with this. Look, I completely agree. We ought to be working together on school safety issues. We ought to pass the Luke and Alex School Safety Act. We ought to pass the Eagles Act. But this isn't just about schools. This is about these horrific mass shootings that happen everywhere. We ought to pass Jamie's law that my constituent, Fred Gunberg, who lost his daughter Jamie, has worked so hard on, to require background checks on ammo. There's a lot that we can do. And finally, when Governor Abbott says that there's a problem getting access to mental health care, we should surge mental health care professionals into every underserved community in our country. You should all work with us. Everyone should work to get that done. This is a reasonable piece of legislation that will help to save lives. It's important that we do it. We owe it to every family who continues to suffer, as so many in my community continue to. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your bringing this bill forward for markup, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Deming seek recognition?